Stalin collapsed at his dacha in Kontsovo sometime early on 1st March 1953. I have already shown you this dacha. It's near Moscow. His guards were not allowed to enter his room without his invitation, so they did not dare to for a long time. They only entered when they received mail for him. They saw him on the floor. He wetted himself and seemed unable to speak, but he was conscious. He made a gesture, and the guards lifted him and put him on the sofa. They immediately informed Ignatieff, the security minister, but the last thing the minister wanted was to take the responsibility to invite doctors, a suspect group, to treat the leader. So he told the guards to contact Beria and Malenkov. They contacted Malenkov, and soon Malenkov, Beria, Khrushchev and Bulganin arrived. They did not dare to enter the room either, so they first interrogated the guards. Then finally Malenkov and Beria quietly entered the room and found Stalin seemingly asleep. So the leaders dismissed the guards' report of Stalin's condition a few hours earlier and returned to Moscow. Next morning, 2nd March, the guards contacted them again. They said that Stalin did not seem at all well. Malenkov, Beria, Khrushchev and Bulganin convened the bureau of the Presidium. The bureau finally decided to invite the doctors. The doctors ascertained that Stalin had suffered a stroke and that his condition was terminal. Did Stalin's colleagues leave him without medical help out of fear of provoking his anger? Or maybe they simply did not want him to recover? This has been a matter of much speculation, but whatever the truth, the doctor's verdict showed that even if Stalin had been treated immediately, there was little that could be done to save him. His arteriosclerosis had developed over a long time, and the hemorrhage in his brain made his death inevitable. The official meeting of the Bureau of the Central Committee's Presidium was convened on 2nd March after the doctor's visit. Apart from the Bureau members, it was attended by Molotov, Mikoyan, Nikolai Shvernik, chairman of the Supreme Soviet, and Matvei Shkiryatov, chairman of the party's Control Commission. The presence of Molotov and Mikoyan in particular, both of them out of favor, was an act of defiance to Stalin. It was an attempt at recreating a collective leadership. This was an existential crisis, just as at the beginning of the war, and so the leadership had to be united. The meeting of the Bureau on 3rd March decided to inform the media about Stalin's illness and to convene the Central Committee plenum. Here's workers listening to the news about Stalin's illness with great sadness. On 4th March, Beria and Malenkov prepared proposals for the reorganization of power. They were discussed with the leadership, including Molotov and Mikoyan. Proposals presented to the plenum consisted of dismantling all the innovations that Stalin introduced in the government structures in the last months of his life. The expanded presidium was cut in size. The new younger members appointed by Stalin were expelled. The bureau of the presidium was to include Molotov and Mikoyan, Malenkov was to occupy Stalin's position as chairman of the Council of Ministers. Khrushchev was allocated the position of secretary of the Central Committee. Malenkov's deputies, Beria, Molotov, Bulganin, and Kaganovich, were not his juniors, either in experience or in their position in the party hierarchy. The Central Committee plenum started at 8 o'clock in the evening the next day, 5th March. It ended 40 minutes later. No objections to the new order were raised. Stalin was still alive. He was demoted from his top positions and diminished to a mere membership of the Central Committee Presidium. But he had no chance to find out about the resolutions. He died just an hour after it ended. Stalin was buried on 9th March. His sarcophagus was placed in the mausoleum in Red Square next to Lenin's. For 3 days prior to the funeral, many thousands passed by Stalin's open coffin in the hall of the House of the Unions. Party leaders stood as an honor guard. For the majority of those who came to say farewell to their leader, Stalin was the only leader they'd ever known. Massive crowds in the narrow streets of Moscow had little direction of where to go. In some places, chaos ended in tragedy. People were crushed to death. The number is not known. The documents relating to this tragedy are still classified. You can see the size of the crowd, but it is only one street in Moscow. Moscow was almost all like that. This is a crowd right in front of the entrance. And these are leaders standing guard, the new leadership standing guard at Stalin's open coffin. The funeral was followed by an upsurge of arrests for expressions of ill feelings towards the fallen leader. The arrested people were charged with anti-Soviet agitation. But Stalin's heirs did not waste time in their haste to dismantle his legacy. Already on 3rd April, the Presidium rehabilitated the accused in the doctor's plot. Those who survived were freed. The security officers who fabricated the charges and tortured victims were convicted. Molotov's wife was released. The Mingrelian affair was closed. Many prominent victims of Stalin's repression were posthumously rehabilitated. Other reforms followed at an amazing speed and were quite decisive. State security and the Gulag were reformed. On 4th April, the Ministry of Internal Affairs banned the use of torture in interrogation. Torture chambers in security offices and in prisons were closed and tools of torture destroyed. An amnesty for common criminals was announced. Construction sites and factories which used prison labor and were supervised by security officials were closed down. Stalin's projects of building communism and expanding Soviet military capacity were stopped. The resources gained were directed to agriculture and to alleviating the hardships of Soviet people. The purchase price for agricultural produce was raised. Taxes on peasants were reduced, and even on a larger scale than originally planned. An increase in agricultural production came amazingly quickly. On 19th March, the Council of Ministers passed a resolution calling for an end of the war in Korea. The new leadership sent signals to the communist parties of the Soviet bloc that they should liberalize to a degree. Whatever the faults, fails, and crimes of the Soviet leadership in the decades that followed, a personal dictatorship as a form of government was never to return. Isaac Deutscher, a communist, a Trotskyist, an author and historian, wrote, "During a quarter of a century, Stalinism, without compunction or pity, and yet with some suppressed compassion, drove a nation of 160 to 100 millions to jump the chasm which separated the epoch of wood and plough from that of the atomic pile." The question is whether the jump was worth it, with so many millions falling into the chasm.